when it comes to disaster relief, like we could swoop in and save, like if I just gave in the right place or donated the right thing, I could save the day.
Melissa Jones is a nonprofit consultant.
An expert in nonprofit management and philanthropic giving.
3 master's degrees.
A law degree from Georgetown University.
Nonprofits.
$5.2 billion.
Disaster capitalism.
The right now is about you more than about what's happening.
Foundations, are they really doing good or are they just scamming us out of our money? Welcome to Slay.
Thank you for having me.
Not a problem. Melissa, what does a nonprofit consultant do?
Well, I think there are a broad range of nonprofit consultants in the field. My particular specialty is strategic planning and infrastructure development. That means that I go into organizations, I help them set up a 3 to 5 year typically plan with goals and priorities. And that's after doing a large organizational assessment to kind of establish how the organization is running. I look at everything from the budgeting, the tax reporting for the organization, the employee and human resources aspects, and then also their programmatic content, the type of activities the organization engages in to further their mission. And then from there, we make plans for the future.
Amazing. When you're assessing a nonprofit, what are the things that you're looking at to determine whether a charity is doing good work?
Well, I think this is more, there are 2 hats I would wear for this. One is the more professional side. So what I'm looking at as a consultant and with a particular aim of helping the organization grow. On the flip side of that, I also have experience in the philanthropic side of things, giving. I have studied that side of the field extensively as well, and also worked with organizations that help to foster community in the giving of time and resources. So I think, and do a lot of that myself. And so I think in that aspect, I may be looking for slightly different things than what I'm doing when I'm wearing my professional hat.
What different things would you be looking for?
Well, if I'm looking at it from a personal perspective, and thinking of where to donate my time, my resources, I'm specifically looking for organizations, one, that are engaging in community. I think a red flag with a lot of nonprofits is if you find a nonprofit that's just trying to be the best, that's not working in concert with other organizations. And I mean that both vertically and horizontally. So, if I'm an organization that is aiming to um, work with the unhoused population in Los Angeles, I may be looking at things like, do they have relationships in builders of affordable housing? Do they have relationships with communities that are specifically like prone to homelessness? So perhaps, mental illness or um, uh, incarceration, coming out of prison. I think those are all things like you want an organization that's working together, because you want to be strengthening the community as a whole. So I think if you find an organization that wants to be the end all be all, that to me is like a big red flag that they're probably not aligned with my own set of values and the things that I prize.
Mm. So when disaster strikes, like it has done recently here in Los Angeles, what's the first thing that we should be doing in those times as people that want to help and come to aid or assistance?
I think disaster relief is an interesting element of the nonprofit and philanthropic worlds in the sense that when we see images as humans, we respond to that. And our instinct is to want to jump in. But disaster relief is, you might have heard the phrase thrown around here lately, disaster capitalism, which is kind of this whole complex of ideas of people who swoop in sometimes to actually take advantage of disaster. So for example, developers that might swoop in to burn houses offer large sums of money to establish communities to try to get them to move on so they can build big new buildings, things like that. But also it's like this idea that um, even some nonprofit organizations, that's their bread and butter. That's what they're running on is stepping in to help out in times of disaster. So they're making a lot of their money during that time as well. And so I think it's important to kind of, yes, to act. I'm not encouraging anyone to just say, let's see how this turns out, because it does feel immediate. But most disasters have a long tail in the world these days. And we can talk more specifically about some examples from the LA fires. And I do think that there has to be some consideration on the giver's part about what is the need. There has to be some learning, some listening. I have, as we have talked about previously, I I have studied the development of nonprofits in the United States. And when the philanthropic era of giving really took off was essentially the robber baron era of US history, so the late 1800s into the early 1900s, kind of in tandem with the rise of millionaires in the country and the explosion of the New York Stock Exchange. And those things are related. Um, as
How?
people began to make excessive amounts of money and we had greater wealth discrepancy, people began to, like, some of these men decided, okay, I should probably start giving more of this, like giving back in some way. So we see Carnegie, we see Rockefeller establishing foundations, starting libraries, doing these things. And I think from the most generous standpoint, we might say, okay, like they realized that there were some problems and they had a little bit of extra disposable income, so they put
Mm.
it into places. I think a more, some might say cynical, I think a more realistic view is they realized that they were developing reputations for really squashing labor in their practices. So, to the extent of violence in some cases of their workers at their steel factories, at their oil factories, like they were able to, um, they denied their workers certain rights. And so building a string of libraries felt like a good offset.
Mm.
Today, we might call this white saviorism, like
Mhm.
this idea that, like, oh, I've earned this much money, so I have some special status,
Mhm.
and I can make better decisions than your average person. We might have seen some of those people at the inauguration today. So I think this idea of like being able to kind of um, absolve yourself from some of
Mm.
the guilt or from even just in the public eye by giving. We still see that today. So I think in when it comes to disaster relief, there is still that idea that, oh, we could swoop in and save. Like if I just gave in the right place or donated the right thing, I could save the day.
Mm.
And I guess my harsh words for everyone are that you're probably not going to save the day. So I would say to take a little more time and caution to think through, okay, I'm seeing a lot of big names. I think here we see this collision with the social media age. We're very used to getting i- inundated by information that we don't always fact check, that
Mm.
just becomes true to us because we've seen it so many times. I mean, that's basically the playbook for certain politicians in the country, right? Like if we say it enough times, it'll be true. People will think that it's true. But we're all subject to this because we're scrolling, and the way our brains work, we see something a certain amount of times. Oh, it's true. So we might see influencers um, touting say a charity at a time of disaster relief, and we think, oh, like this person has all these followers. And somehow our brains are convinced they have some authority here. This must be the place to give. But I can tell you for most of those big names that you're seeing all over the place, those organizations are clearing millions and millions of dollars this year. And you're an adult. Well, if there are children listening to this podcast, you will be an adult someday. But everyone else is an adult and you can make your own decisions. But you doing a little Instagram fundraiser and pulling in $1,000 to go to a giant organization that's making, say, $247 million a year is a very small drop in the bucket, as
Mm.
opposed to if you were able to give directly to communities.
Mm.
So here in the fires, one of the communities that you mentioned, Altadena, is a historic Black community in the area. It was a place where, after the Great Migration, Blacks could still buy homes, even outside of the redlining practices that were happening in a lot of other areas of LA. So if you want that community to still have roots there,
Mm.
then you need to look for organizations that are run by Black communities.
Mhm.
It's not going to be the big name out of state or white led organization you want to look for the people who are actually on the ground in that community.
Why is that?
Because they're most proximate to the problem. So they know what it's like to live there. A great example is there's a bookstore just outside of the area of Altadena, um, called Octavia's bookstore, and named for Octavia Butler, a famous resident of Pasadena. Um, and their owner, Nikki, is a resident of Altadena as well. Her home was damaged during the fires, and she had to evacuate, and she converted the whole bookstore into a space for
Mm.
community members to come get what they need, drop items, pick up items, like just so being able to support her. She had a Venmo so that people who lived out of state could donate money to help one keep the bookstore afloat while it wasn't a bookstore,
Mhm.
and then two, like allow it to be this space for community to gather. And I stopped by there several times, as have several of my bookish friends. As you know, I'm a big reader, big supporter of reading. And that is the sort of place where people were coming to have those conversations, to talk about what was going on, to share what they'd heard, and then to talk about like how they were coming together to kind of support one another in that effort. And I think that's very different than the outsiders that swoop in, um, who sure are maybe providing meals, maybe like helping in some ways, but I think the efforts of the people on the ground are always going to be the closest to the problem, and so the closer to the solutions. And again, I don't want to get too deep until unless you want me to in
Yes,
nonprofit
please.
history, but
Absolutely.
I think um it, there's also this idea that um again, there was this idea that certain people had more of the answers than others. And I will tell you that at this point in our history, the 10 in the Forbes list of from 2023 of the 10 top earning, highest revenue nonprofits, almost half of those were started in the same era as that era I spoke of, the robber baron era, at the turn of the 20th century, so late
Mm.
1800s, early 1900s. Ideally, a nonprofit is working to solve a mission, And that mission is charitable, which is why they have special tax status.
Mhm.
And the idea is obviously to try to solve that mission.
Are they always successful?
And they're almost never successful, at least on the large scale. So, for example, the largest in 2023, the largest philanthropic organization in America was Feeding America.
Mhm.
They made $5.2 billion in revenue.
Wow. How
Um,
much?
$5.2 billion in revenue.
Have you seen their tax return?
And I have
What
not
is it
pulled up
called?
their
A
990s. I
990?
have to stop myself sometimes from getting too deep in the tax weeds. For everyone listening, tax law was what I studied at Georgetown. So the 990 is the IRS form that nonprofits complete that gives you information about how they're bringing in money and then how they're spending it.
So how did they spend that
So,
5.2
well, I
billion?
didn't look at those returns, but
Yeah.
presumably 5.2 billion, that's a lot. And I don't know, or I think there are still parts of America that are unfed as far as I do think that the larger organizations, and of those 10 that I just mentioned from
Mhm.
that Forbes list, um, they all are at least close to 1 billion, if not over a billion, in that year, in 1 year's time.
Wow.
When you think about that, that's you almost have to have corporate structures in place to be able to support an organization that is bringing in that kind of revenue. That takes a lot of infrastructure, and the more infrastructure you have, the more continuity becomes a major focus of the organization, because now you've got 100 employees, 200 employees, 5,000 employees, 10,000 employees. Those are their jobs. So I think there are arguments to be made for, like, okay, but we're contributing to the economy, we're giving people jobs. But let's just go back.
To
The
the
the purpose of a nonprofit is to solve the mission.
Mhm.
And so isn't there a tension there if you're like, "Oh, we have to keep these people employed, but also we're supposed to be solving this mission so that we don't exist. We're supposed to be essentially working ourselves out of existence."
Right. Has any nonprofit ever managed to do that and solve its mission?
Well, one of the earlier nonprofits in America, it's no longer in the top 10 that I just mentioned in 2023, but has been a big driver, and was also founded around that turn of the 20th century mark, was the March of Dimes. Their initial mission was to cure polio, which they did.
Incredible.
And then they rewrote their mission to do something different. So they're still in existence, but now with a different mission.
So did they rewrite it to be something more sustainable or with like not without an
Yes,
end
they
game
have
in
a
sight?
broader mission now. I
Right.
think
Broader mission. That's what
that
I was
is
looking
like,
for.
and so this goes back to what I was saying, about working. A lot of my work is with smaller organizations, yes, that are local, but also organizations that are working in tandem, with other organizations to work on these intractable problems, so that each one of them is kind of working on a piece of it. When I was in Washington, D.C., working there with nonprofits, I worked a lot in the food access and hunger space. So
Mhm.
organizations that were, yes, doing meal services, things like that, but also organizations that were working to make fresh, healthy food more accessible to a wide population. And for a long time, that community had a lot of overlap. And DC really worked they established as a government, they established a food policy council, and then they really worked to kind of bring those nonprofits into spaces together so they could more discuss kind of what everyone's part of the wheel kind of was, so they could continue to chip away at that problem without everyone competing for the same funds, the same sponsors, the
Mm.
same space,
Mhm.
and instead start to like work on that in some ways. And I think, we saw, one of the organizations I worked with, DC Greens, piloted a program that allowed, uh, at different farmers markets, allowed these kind of food bucks, so that people who didn't always have the disposable income to shop at a farmer's market, allowed them to come and and support farmers and buy fresh, healthy food. And their pilot was so successful that the DC government took it on as a program. And that's kind of
Wow.
ideal because then government is doing that work. And ideally, that's what we want, right? We want a government that is like taking care of its people.
Mm.
And I think, the interesting thing about that is another stage in kind of our development of nonprofit and charitable history in America is that there were always from the founding of America, of white America, there have always been kind of mutual aid societies. There have been churches from various immigrant communities that helped their members. There've always been ways that people helped each other, that
Mhm.
acted in community. Um, but we never really saw, there was never really a need for food banks to
Why
the
was
extent
that?
that we see now until the 1980s. And
Mm.
in the Reagan era, the government scrolled back a lot of social services programs, a lot of programs that helped families. And, you'll remember, some of you, if you're old enough, that Reagan was the president who talked about welfare queens. And so that's what the system was called then. And he rolled back a lot of those programs. And we saw a lot of food banks pop up
Mhm.
more extensively because of the fact that people were no longer getting assistance from the government to be able
Mm.
to do that. So I think there's also, um, a need to kind of recognize all of these people are working in the space, which is why one of the other things that I was just saying, besides working with small local organizations, is to also think outside of charitable giving,
Mhm.
in the sense that if you're really committed to community
Yep.
and wanting everyone to kind of have what they need, like
Mm.
even just starting with basic needs before we even move into the same opportunities, everything else, but like food, shelter, these things, then I think like there has to be an openness to. Right now we see a lot of GoFundMe's
Mhm.
and we see a lot of mutual aid, which are not 501(c)(3 designated. Some are, but some aren't.
What's a mutual aid? Explain that.
So mutual aid is usually a community-based
Mhm.
and community-run
Mhm.
organization that is kind of doing what I described Nikki was doing at Octavia's bookstore, which is kind of this idea of trading, like giving people what they need when they need it.
Mhm.
So um donating your time or your services. It can be everything from, there are some accountants in your neighborhood who donate free time during tax season to do your taxes,
Mhm.
if because you can't hire a consultant and you need help.
Got you.
It could be like, oh, you keep here in LA, we have a lot of mutual aid refrigerators in
Mhm.
various places that can be stocked by people. Little free libraries, I mean, close to my heart. Those are kind of mutual aid in the sense that, you're taking books that you loved and you're putting them in a space for others to share them. So I think it's kind of just that sharing of resources.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think that is another great way to kind of be a part of making a difference during, especially during times of acute disaster,
Mm.
without, delving into that realm of the super mega charitable organizations.
So if I want to be a careful giver and a considerate giver, then, what are the things that I need to, what do I need to take into consideration? So you talked about, obviously, not necessarily jumping straight in and going to large corporations. You talked about, GoFundMe and mutual aids, but why is giving to, individuals via GoFundMe a better idea?
Well, it's not necessarily better depending on like what you're comparing and contrasting it to. It's just another option. And so one of the ways that I encourage people and organizations to start, when I start my strategic planning with a nonprofit, the first thing we do, the very first thing, is we identify institutional values. Like, what does this organization value? What what do you as a human value? And I think that can be everything. So maybe you pick 3 to 5 principles that are at your core.
Mhm.
So that can be things like freedom or democracy, accountability, innovation, generosity. There are so many things. And just kind of thinking about, okay, when I live my life, this is something I think about all the time. And you can even do it in reverse. I'm not above a little negativity. So you might be like, I hate it when people do this. And
Right.
then you can reverse that into thinking, okay, what's the value here, right? So I think identifying those and then um using those to kind of jump off into, okay, what do I actually then what do those lead me to really, really care about? So if let's say safety, right?
Mhm.
Like is something that you really care about in your life. Like that makes a big difference to you, like feeling like you have a place that you can go to where you feel safe and accepted. And so then like maybe housing is a big thing for you. Maybe you're like, oh, I really care about getting people back into homes after this fire and
Mm.
then moving forward in LA. That can help you identify some of those things. And I think it can also help you identify inconsistencies in your own practices, which is something I have organizations do as well, is to take those values and not just look at, okay, how are we using those towards achieving our mission? But also, do we practice these values in the office with
Mm.
each other? Adrienne Marie Brown is a dreamer, an artist, a writer, also a podcaster. And they have a book called Emergent Strategy that is practically my Bible. And in it, they talk about fractals and
What are
a
fractals?
fractal is in I'm not a super science person, but a fractal is like a repeating pattern usually found in nature. So it's at the smallest level and then it repeats itself over and over. You might find them in some plants, you can find them in snowflakes, you can find them in and they repeat over and over, but it has to start with the original pattern.
Mm.
And then it branches out and branches out and branches out. So if I say I believe in democracy, but I run a business and in my business, I'm the boss and I don't have space to listen to anybody else, then do I really value democracy?
Right.
Because I can't expect democracy to be happening in our country or in our state or in our city if I'm not even practicing it within my own office or home or wherever else. So I think the values conversation for people who really want to engage with community and shape change long term, you have to like engage with your values. And then I think the next thing you have to decide is really have to think about what is your personal comfort level. I think another thing that we were going to talk about eventually is that it doesn't have to be money. There are a lot of ways to give. Uh, and I think assessing your own personal comfort level is really important. I know some people who wanted to give so much that they lived in their car for half a year so that they could give more away and help more people by being in, being mobile and being that's very extreme, And then I think there are also people who don't like feel like, "Oh, I don't even know if I could do $100
Mhm.
monetarily a year." In LA, we're really lucky. LA is very activist based.
Mm.
Another era in our history around the charitable nonprofit and change organizations was obviously the civil rights era. We're recording on MLK Day. Um, and those movements are the blueprint for so much of what we do today and try to practice. And that's the idea. The Black Panthers are one of the best examples of mutual aid out there. Providing kids breakfast for kids who didn't have food was huge. And I think there's so many of practices from that era that we can also look into. And those are things like peacefully protesting,
Mhm.
getting involved in voting and researching or maybe running for office yourself, like researching who best represents those values we talked about. I think that we can also think about, given where we are at our own personal comfort level, maybe um, I could have some reason why I can't march in the streets, right?
Right.
I might just not feel as comfortable with that. Everyone doesn't have to do everything, but
Mm.
I might know a ton of people who are going to a particular protest. I can have those people over for pizza afterwards. I can like support them, check in on them, see how they're doing. I think you can also support the people. I have so many friends, obviously, in this sector. And a big part of what I want to do is supporting them, like holding them. I think anyone that's been through grief in their life knows how important it is to have those people kind of enveloping you to get you through that. And I think people who are deep in this work, it is grieving
Mm.
every day to a
Mm.
certain extent. It is also hope and joy, but some days can be very hard. And I think being there to support them is something that also shouldn't be overlooked, like paying attention,
Mm.
understanding.
Mhm.
So when you say, how much should we be giving? I think that, that depends on those values. It depends on what you're also willing to sacrifice.
Mm.
Um, if you can't give away 75% of your yearly income if you also want to have 3 houses and trips to Europe every summer. That, for most of us, I guess we do have billionaires in that country where
They'll
this
be
country where they
fine.
could do that. But I do think that you kind of have to think, how do I want to engage? And the other thing that, coming back to disaster relief, that we
Mm.
see a lot is people rush in and
Right.
rush out.
Right.
It all comes swelling in. We see this huge outpouring. The media cycles away from it. I mean, already this weekend, I get actual physical copies of the paper on Sunday. And the LA Times is obviously still full of fire news, and there's so much work to be done. I think the New York Times, there was maybe one article and it was buried in the center. So
Mm.
we're already cycling on a national level
So
away from
is there any
it.
is there any downside to that initial huge concentration of support and then, moving on in the news cycle and perhaps moving on in our donations and our giving? What's the impact therefore on nonprofit organizations and more importantly, those people on ground level who are experiencing the disaster firsthand?
I think going back to something we also touched upon earlier is that listening and learning as part of this practice of really not, again, fighting the urge to be like, I can save this, and instead kind of listening and thinking, what are these needs? And here in LA, we've seen people from out of state shipping dirty clothes here, like doing, like it's become an issue how much clothing has come in, and now we're running into a problem where there isn't anywhere to put it. And so we have nonprofits here that are working now to gather some of those textile type products up and try to convert them to something else so that they're not
Wow.
just thrown into landfills. So I, I do think like that pause can be important to kind of understand. If you have friends here who are involved, reaching out to them and saying, what are you hearing there? Like, what's actually happening? Like, what are you? And then I think also this is part of that long-term commitment to change. There is a certain, you know, beauty in being able to be like, no, I'm going to commit to this for the long term.
Right.
And so
What
that
does that
might
look
that
like?
might mean I don't give away, like if I have a certain dollar amount, if I'm going to give money, and that this is what I think about giving, like, every year or whatever, or this is even like the disposable income that I have to do that. Um, Saying like, let me wait 3 months down the line to bring this back to the grief conversation again. I think we all know how much people check in when we lose a loved one
Mm.
in that first day, week. Um, and then we don't, and then people stop asking.
Mm.
And those can be the hardest times because 3 months later, that may be the time that you're really missing that person. And everyone's like, oh, I thought you were okay. And so I think, that it's fine to also wait and think, okay, what's happening now? Because disasters are never just that moment. There are repercussions here in LA. We're seeing a huge impact economically. A lot of our core workers and people who really subsist paycheck to paycheck
Hmm.
some of them have lost homes, but a lot of them have also lost jobs. The
Right.
Palisades is a wealthy area. They had gardeners, they had housekeepers. Those are people that are out of work right now. We have organizations here that are working. Inclusive Action is one that comes to mind. They just did a big project where they raised funds to give people a small stipend to try to tide them over that are in those type of especially outdoor work jobs. And so I think there are elements to look into that go a little deeper like that so
Mm.
that you can, and then for real change. And I think it's just a good practice. If I could wish one thing for everyone, it would be to be curious, to pull on the thread a little bit more, to not just say, wow, fire's so tragic, but instead to be like, why did they have these massive fires? And to continue to why did this go so badly? And to learn more about, here partially because of climate change, partially, maybe city preparedness. There are a lot of things that might come into play. And then working on those, being able to say, okay, I don't want to see this. I don't want to see these kind of massive hurricanes in Florida and floods in Asheville and fires in California.
Mm.
So maybe I do want to think more about voting for more candidates that actually recognize climate change or looking for organizations that are fighting climate change on the large scale. So I think there are a lot of ways you can go instead of just thinking, I got to do something right now, because the right now, um, I say this with love, the right now is about you
Right.
more than about what's happening. It's about trying to put some ease into how you feel about consuming this, and to really stay involved, you have to have a pathway to continue to maintain. And I think that means not burning yourself out in one moment.
Mm. So,
Just like with exercise, Lou, look at that.
I mean, it makes
It's like
it makes complete and utter sense.
I can't go in and deadlift 400 pounds tomorrow because
I
then
think
that's
you
it.
could, Melissa. Based on our current conversation, I think you could. One of the questions that came up through Instagram earlier was, what was the biggest myth? What is the biggest myth that we, the people, the general population, have about charitable donations? What's the one thing we need to
Ooh.
know?
Um, well, I think some people have probably heard some surprising things already in this conversation. I think knowing that there are $1 billion nonprofits in America is probably surprising to most people. I would think that that is something that, so I think thinking that um all charitable enterprises are underfunded and struggling to get by, and that's a myth. Because I think there are many organizations, a lot of the organizations here, big name organizations here that have a lot of front facing celebrities are actually carrying over. I have looked at some 990s, but in their tax reporting have carried over, upwards of, say a $50 million organization carrying over 10 to 15 million a year. That's a lot of surplus. And I think most people think the money is coming in and the money is going out in a nonprofit.
Right. Sure. I thought the whole point of a non-profit was that they spend all of their money
Right. It's
by
the
the end of
non
the
in
year.
profit.
Right. So why would they want to stockpile those resources rather than, make those donations or disperse that money or resources into the mission?
I think it's become, and this is, so there's another aspect of this world, which is foundations, which we really haven't talked about, but that would be like the Rockefeller Foundation, the
Hmm.
Ford Foundation. those are endowments typically. So, for example, Ford and Rockefeller are good, easy examples because they're started by Henry Ford and then obviously Rockefeller, and uh, they were kind of legacy funds where they took a bunch of their money and put it in an organization. Um, I'm not going to say it was for the tax break for their heirs, but it might have been for the tax break. And and then those foundations have been running essentially in perpetuity, which means that each year they only have to give away 5 to 8%, I think is what the IRS regulation now is, of the principal endowment. So the rest is usually invested. So so it really is part of the capitalistic system because it's literally invested in capitalism. So it continues to grow, and the rationale around this has always been, well, what if there's like a really big event? And the money is needed then, like for that catastrophe.
Hmm.
Um, and then COVID happened. And we really had a big catastrophe
Right.
and most places didn't up their spending or get rid of their in perpetuity. Not all foundations, I want to clarify, are in perpetuity. Some do something called sunsetting, which means they try to spend down their money until it's out of existence. So the reason this plays into nonprofits is I think this has seeped into the nonprofit world, this kind of idea of, oh, we need some for a rainy day sort of situation.
Right.
So that mentality has become more accepted. Also,
So
a-
just to dial back a little bit, foundations,
mhm.
are they really doing good, or are they just scamming us out of our money?
Well, most of us aren't giving to foundations. They're living off these endowments they already have. So we're not donating to them and the money's already there. So
But
they're just
non-profits have basically learned from the structure of foundations
I think
and
that there's some probably bleed over there, but the second part was what we talked about earlier is some of these large organizations um have many, many employees because they're so huge. I mean, think about it, like an operation that's doing in the billions of dollars is got to employ a lot of people.
right.
And so there's also this idea of oh, we're having this in reserve in case something catastrophic happens so we can still continue to pay our operations in that catastrophic event. I don't I have trouble especially for some of these bigger organizations thinking like, what's that gonna be? So for
Mm,
a smaller organization, the ones I work with, we encourage them to start a separate savings fund where they are like keeping some money in reserve. So let's say a big foundational grant falls through and they're only a $1 million organization
right.
or even a $500,000 organization per year that they're bringing in. If a big grant falls through, yeah, we don't want them to have to fire all their employees while they
Mm,
do some fundraising to make up for it. So we do want them to have a little. But then when you multiply that to scale, and I
yes.
think again in America, we
What's
have
what's
the
the
to scale, to
impact?
scale, to scale. Like you want to scale everything, like scaling is good.
Bigger is better.
But that's not always true. And I think we see that a lot in the nonprofit world for many of the reasons we've already discussed, from either losing touch with the community that you're actually trying to help because you're not involved with it, to these kind of economies of scale where it's not actually an economy of scale. Like it's not helping you to be bigger. If anything, it's creating more paperwork,
Mm.
more red tape, less nimbleness and fluidity to be able to respond to situations. If you've got, this whole team or a whole decision making chain to be able to answer to.
So serious inefficiencies. So how do I ensure that my money is going to good use? Like, what is the answer? How do I make sure that, I'm donating to a charity? How can I, the average person, be like, you know what, I've heard, or I know, or I found out from my own digging that this charity is working really efficiently, or I'm only donating to certain nonprofits because I value efficiency and I want to know that my money's going exactly where I need it to go.
Um, I think, again, let's go back to community. So I think relationships are the key to everything.
Mm.
So I think that actually coming to the organization with humility, let's say I'm going to make a big donation. Let's say I have enough disposable income and I'm like, I really care about this. I want to make a bigger investment in my city. They're going to reach out to you. Most good organizations are going to reach out if you make a even $1,000 donation, but probably like five, $10,000. They're going to reach out, get to know that organization, like show some interest, not from a paternalistic way, like I want to come in here and, do X, Y, and Z, but from a what can I learn, but not be in the way sort of mentality. So I think that's one thing is to really um engage in the community. Or if you know someone that knows someone, then you're already have this trusted source, right? Like with
Mhm.
GoFundMe's, I've been encouraging people if someone on social media is like, this is my friend, or that's perfect,
Because there's a lot of skepticism, isn't there, around GoFundMe's?
So yes. And so I was also going to say that we're all human. Um, and I think again, in this age, we start to give people some level of expertise that they might not have. Like I'm trying not to name drop, and it's taking a lot of restraint, but I'm just going to
Who?
name Elon Musk.
Oh,
So Elon Musk might be good at, I don't know, building cars, I guess. I don't even understand at this point what his real gig once was, but he has no expertise in any other area. And we're just like, here's a rich man who started a good company and now is like literally ruining other companies.
right.
But somehow we should, oh, he might have an answer for certain people, not maybe for all of us. But like that's the sort of thing that I think, we have to push back on a little is to kind of think of this as we're all humans. I might have a little more experience in a area that might be helpful to you and vice versa.
Right.
I'm not going to go in and start training someone in the gym.
Right.
Even though I've been an athlete my whole life, I have not that's not something that I've done, and I don't think that it would benefit anyone for me to do that. I'm not going to hold myself out in that way.
Right.
So but some people will. And so I think it's like a question of like one asking more questions about that to make sure that your sources are
So that you feel comfortable with, like, donating on a
valued
GoFundMe.
sources, right? Me
Right.
coming to you to ask you, is a bowl of cereal and a banana and a piece of peanut butter toast too much in my macro profile for breakfast makes a lot more sense than me going to, getting my hair cut and asking my hairstylist those
Right.
questions.
Got you.
So I think you want to really, like I said, be curious about those sources.
But what if
Then I
what if you're
also
giving to, like, a stranger and you
okay,
just
well,
wanna do
my other
something
thing
good?
I was gonna say about money is let's all be honest here. We're like buying things from Amazon every day, and that man is literally ruining the world. Like, he's not paying his workers. He's like hurting people in factories by like, making them wear diapers in the warehouses. There's so many stories out there, but we are all still buying from Amazon. So, getting moralistic about your money is something we all need to keep in check. Like, most of us, a few of us have purely electric cars, but a lot of us are still putting gas in our cars. That we're supporting the oil companies that are partially responsible for the forest fires we just saw in Los
Mm.
Angeles.
Mm.
So I don't think anyone is like practicing purity across the board in the way that their money is spent.
Right. But when it comes to, like, donating, perhaps
We somehow have this in our heads that like, oh, we
they're gonna
have to
go,
do this perfectly because what?
like, a
Like
fear of
if
somebody
if
mismanaging
I give $50 to my friends GoFundMe and like they buy, I don't know, like
Lego,
yeah, what,
whatever.
why do I care? Why would that, like that money is now gone. That's a sunk cost if you want to talk in economic terms. So it is what it is. And I say that we need to be a little more when I aim to give away a lot of my, my earned income through, my investments, I aim to give away at least 50% of that every year. I never ask any questions. I just, like, write the checks. I donate to the places that need it. I wish them well and support them if they ask for it in other ways. And that's it. Because if they want to talk to me about it or bring me to an event or do, I'd love to see it. But that is, once that money is out the door, it's going to do what it's going to do. And I think like that is, and to me, change works at the speed of trust. This is
Mm.
also from Emergent Strategy. That is, I wish that was my own phrase, but it
We'll
is not.
pretend it is.
Um, Change works at the speed of trust. And so I think, we also have to have these moments where we are placing trust in our community. And that's why if you get close to the ground, if you get close to the communities that are really impacted, that is gonna feel you're gonna feel that a lot more than
Mm.
if you're giving to that $5.2 billion organization. Sure, maybe somebody there started a relationship with you. I'm not saying that can't happen. I'm not even saying you can never donate to those places. I always in philanthropic portfolios, I encourage a range of different giving.
Mhm.
Everything from 501(c)(3)s, which we've talked about, those are the charitable organizations, big and small. There are two main avenues of 501(c)(3)s, and that is direct services. So
Mhm.
those are the organizations you see feeding people meals,
Yep.
um, actual physical, tangible things that are happening right there, maybe handing out supplies or clothes.
Yep.
And then you have organizations that are working for social change. So they
Mhm.
may be advocating for certain uh, policies or legislation. They may be working to change. I like here. There are a lot of organizations that are working on issues around uh, incarceration.
Mhm.
So they might be working on systems change. I encourage like supporting both. Like I said, there's that through line of making change and then also supporting things that aren't 501(c)(3)s like in disasters, sometimes things like GoFundMe's and small businesses. Like don't overlook supporting going to here in LA right now, our restaurants are really suffering.
Yep.
And that's not just a restaurant problem, like, "Oh, I'm so sorry you can't go out to eat." That all those restaurants employ people too.
Mm.
And so, we're seeing the potential collapse of huge portions of our economic system here in LA. So, like, just being able to go to those places and, the mom and pop ones and everything else
Mm.
is I think a way to have an impact in your community and to support overall longer term change. So, I don't think there's any one way, and I think if you are feeling nervous, that is a good way to counteract that is to diversify. Most people who invest money, and not everyone, has the means or is able to do that, but most people that invest money don't invest all your stock isn't in Apple usually,
Mhm.
right? It's like you're divesting into different you should do the same thing with community change and
Mm.
community support.
My mum always said, "If you don't use it, you'll lose it." That's how she justified going to the shop in town. Um, Melissa, what should you definitely not do when it comes to donating and charitable donations?
Well, I think don't give up. I think pacing yourself is key to stay in the fight. Like we all can't consume every article, every news, research every single thing every day. We can't make a monetary donation, most of us, every day or volunteer somewhere every day. But to really be able to see the changes we want to see,
Mhm.
we have to be in the work. And so I think being able to just like we do at the gym, everywhere else, you have to be able to pace yourself through the support and make sure that you're taking the time to regroup, like I said, to listen and learn. You don't want to only listen and learn because if you're never taking action, that's not good either. But I think like taking the time to really also think, okay, what's sustainable for me? And maybe that is, I encourage people to even just starting small. It's really helpful for nonprofits if you have a recurring donation.
Mm.
And that's an easy way to start. So you just sign up on their website, say $10 a month. So that's only $120 a year. But then they know that that's coming in. That's something they can count on every single month and it comes through.
Mhm.
And then maybe each year you up that a little. If that, if you're still supporting and that org is still around, that can be a way to get started. And to continue to stay in it. It might be setting a goal like trying one new avenue of being part of an activist community. So maybe that's like attending an in-person event. It doesn't have to be a protest. It could be a voter registration drive, right? Like there are so many things. So you might be challenging yourself in that way too, but doing it in a way that's sustainable. Not saying, I'm going to show up every single week at this place. One, they might not need you.
Mhm. Yeah, just
So don't
knocking on the
force
door.
yourself into anywhere, but also, I think, to really build that muscle. And I think building that muscle also means, not starting to strip away for yourself the reality of like what is actually happening, because I think it's very easy for us like not to pull on the thread. That's not what we want to do. My dad used to say all the time, and this was probably from the time he was like, even he was probably younger than I am right now when he would say this, but he would always say about his eating habits like, oh, it's too late to change them now. And I was like, I don't really think that's the science. I think that you could. So, but he was afraid that like once he started to learn about all the unhealthy ways he was eating, that thread would just keep unraveling and unraveling and unraveling. And so sometimes we do need to pace ourselves, but I don't think we should hold back from like learning a little bit more about how our actions are having an impact and um and really thinking about how that supports or harms other people. Because I think the sad reality is we're probably all doing some sort of harm
Mm.
indirectly in our lives. And so it's just a constant thing. And that should be a joy. That should be a pleasure to like think, this is something I could change. Like I don't have to do this. And I think the joy that comes from building these communities is so what I saw at Octavia's bookstore was like incredible. Just the feeling there, how people just were talking to each other and coming together, and I think that was an amazing thing most of us experienced here during the fires at
Mm.
such a terrible time was how many people were checking on each other, seeing how they were doing, like opening their
Togetherness.
homes to people that had to leave.
Mhm.
Amazing.
So to underpin that community, which is also one of the reasons that we're even sat here today. So our relationship actually started during the pandemic.
Mm.
And I just want to say, first and foremost, Melissa, thank you for bringing so much insight to the table today. But also, secondly, thank you for sliding into my DMs back in 2020 with a charitable donation for the Slay Gym. You were one of the kind donors that basically solicited a secret sleigh. And you like wanted to remain anonymous and you didn't want anybody to know who was donating or whatever. And I was like, who is this mystery woman? And not only did you support not just one secret sleigh, it was two. And these were basically community workouts for those people who wanted to tune in and were at home, just doing nothing, but still wanted to keep fit. And we were basically doing Instagram lives. And you kept showing up every single day and you kept working out. But not only that, you kept the doors open at Slay. And I'm forever grateful for that. And also, not only did you do that, you then showed up in person as well and have been continuing to support us as, a small business, but also to be an amazing member of our community and a giving member of our community. And for that, we're really, truly thankful. And today's episode is really just another extension of the quality of person that you are.
Oh, that is very kind. But I think that is also what I said, like following your passion, right? So you don't have to necessarily trade off the things that you really care about. I know how much exercise and community both have changed my life. And so supporting something like Slay during that time and bringing other people to that, so easy. And how joyful, like how great that I can share something that buoys me and like keeps me going and get benefits from that, this
Right.
wonderful community I have now.
And box jumps.
But also, yes, killer and amazing bench presses. But
Also.
I think that is something, that is the framing
Mhm.
for all of this, is to frame it in this, like, what a privilege it truly is to be able to be in community.
Mm.
How lucky we all are to have each other and to be able to build in this way and to show up. Getting to show up for someone else is one of the, if not the greatest gift that we get, is that feeling of being able to show up. And so I think that we should never underestimate the power of that presence.
Here, here. Melissa, are there any useful links, websites that you want to provide for anyone that is wanting to put their resources, time into these recent wildfires here in Los Angeles? You mentioned uh, inclusive action.
I I did, and Inclusive Actions, their main drive is, like, past now. I don't know if they'll do another one.
Hmm.
They had been doing a fundraiser for grants, but, I can maybe send you some.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll pop them in the description part of this episode. And Melissa, thank you so much for joining us on the
Thank you
Slay
for
podcast.
having me. How lovely. I love to talk about this.
I love that you love it. That concludes this episode of Slay. Stay tuned for more empowering discussions on female health, fitness, and life. You can follow me at Louise Hazel on social media, and you can follow Melissa at But I Brought Books on Instagram and Substack. You can also follow us at Slay Athletic Club. And don't forget to subscribe to the Slay podcast if you haven't done so already on YouTube. And you can leave us a comment there. You can also get fit at home using the Slay app. Hit the link in my bio to download it now for free from the App Store and join our online community.